The following is an unscripted stream of consciousness discussion between two lifelong pals who love all things rock and roll. I'm Stephen Bard.
And I'm Ryan Ball.
And this is No Holds Barred from Inside the Gearbox.
So how you doing, Stephen?
I'm great, Ryan.
All right. Thanks for being here. This is going to be a lot of fun. This is our first episode ever. And I thought it would be appropriate to open the gates with just a discussion on what we think is the arc, the apex, that encapsulates the golden age of rock and roll. It's quite a subjective topic, I would imagine, but I think there's a lot to be said about that for lots of different reasons. So what would your first instinct be to, where would you begin with that? Not only chronologically, but also in terms of the whole zeitgeist of how that affects our society. And
Yeah. I like what you said, that it's everything. I like to start it off by saying that, of course, everything we say is subjective. It's just two opinions. Everybody's got one, just like that other thing everybody's got. And that's fine.
Nose?
Yeah, everybody, well, you'd hope. So take what we say with a grain of salt or whatever. If it resonates with you, great. If it doesn't, that's fine too. As far as the golden age of popular music, for me, I like rock and roll music. You like rock and roll music. That's my favorite kind of music. That's why we're here, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Rock and roll begins in the late 40s and then the early 50s, and a truck driver named Elvis Presley. But before him, a bunch of genius African Americans keep doing their thing in the urban centers. They come up from the sort of the sharecropping of the South, and they get to Chicago, and they get to Detroit, and they get to these places like the great Chuck Berry, the great Little Richard, the great Fats Domino, Bo Diddley, these incredible artists, pioneers. Elvis co-ops that sort of rhythm and blues / soul approach to something, and puts a touch of country and western and a little rockabilly into it, and there it is. And the bastard child is rock and roll. And make no mistake, rock and roll is a hybrid of black and white, and that's America, right? For me, rock and roll music takes flight in the early 60s with the Beatles and Bob Dylan. And then it flows on from there. So I would call the zeitgeist of rock and roll 1964 is where it begins for me.
I see.
And it blooms through the 60s with the Beatles leading the way, and Bob Dylan going electric because of the Beatles, and the Beatles going folky and acoustic because of Bob Dylan, and the cross-pollination of that. You get a genius like Brian Wilson, who was co-opting Chuck Berry's musical style, and then combining it with jazz vocal harmony, like a la the Four Freshmen. You get the Beach Boys. Yay! And that's a zeitgeist. And then it flows through. The British invasion happens. You get the Stones. You get the Who. You get Pink Floyd. Whoa. And then in the late 60s, after Jimi Hendrix and Cream and Eric Clapton and Pete Townsend and the Who, you get Led Zeppelin. And to me, that's the peak. The peak of it all is 68 to 76.
Okay. Narrow.
Yeah.
Narrow. Okay. The absolute top is
for me. That's the absolute top of the rock and roll art form.
Okay. So where do you think the whole Motown thing fits into that?
Oh, it's central.
That predates the Beatles by a little bit.
A little bit,
right?
by a year or two. It predates. It's 60. Berry Gordy and Smokey Robinson are 1960. And thank you for mentioning that, because Motown is as intrinsically important to popular music as in fact, arguably the most important musical movement and force in modern popular music is probably Berry Gordy and Motown, just given the stable of artists that he had starting in the early 60s and moving from Smokey Robinson to Diana Ross and the Supremes and the Four Tops and the Temptations and then the young Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. Oh, you know, it's beyond. It's beyond. And then Michael Jackson. So, yeah, thank you, Berry Gordy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it's not even a parallel. It's just part of it, I think. You know, it's not like.
Yeah, I don't think it's. Yeah. It's not running parallel or outside of something. It's all the same. The Beatles, like the Beatles are the Beatles. Motown is Motown, and they're basically the same thing, except Motown had many, many faces and many writers and artists.
I think the Beatles, and especially what Paul was doing on the bass, was extremely informed by Motown.
Oh, yeah.
You know, so
Yeah, a guy called James Jamerson.
yeah.
Yay!
So that's
Yeah.
There's a little bit of, I don't know, cross-pollination, because I don't know how much they were paying attention to the Beatles, but, you know,
They
over
were.
at Motown. But
They were well aware
yeah,
of the Beatles.
okay.
And the Beatles were obsessed with Motown.
Right, well, that part is obvious. That's
Yeah.
that's what I was alluding to in that space.
Oh yeah, they all
Yeah.
they all covered the Beatles, and Stevie Wonder covered "We Can Work It Out," and all the great black artists of the '60s were definitely, you know, Ray Charles, Aretha. I think Aretha Franklin did, maybe Eleanor Rigby, or I mean, yeah, they're all over that catalog.
Yeah.
And the Beatles covered 3 great Motown tunes early on. Please, Mr. Postman, You've Really Got a Hold on Me, and Money, That's What I Want,
Right.
which is killer. And for me personally, I always think that the Beatles did better, like Van Halen.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Beatles, whatever they covered,
Improvement.
was an improvement. It was, in my opinion, an improvement. Yeah.
Almost through the filter of their greatness, you know. For
Yeah,
sure.
like Twist and Shout is I mean, the Beatles were a great cover band. They did a lot of great reworkings of songs, mainly by black artists. They're almost entirely black. The Beatles
the
covers.
cover
Yeah, it's
repertoire.
awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, they were initially probably the world's first, not first, but, you know, in terms of how they structured their early live performances, it was covers.
It was all that.
You know,
They were
standards and whatever.
essentially a cover
You
band.
know, so, I mean,
Yep.
that's probably how they got their education as
As
writers,
themselves,
and players. And so I wanted to mention this about sort of the date, the start, you know, where you would consider the high point to have begun. It also coincides with the advent of the artist, the performer, sort of also being the writer, you know. So that ushered in kind of a new
Yeah.
dawn of what music was, what a star, what a pop star, what a you know, a musical artist embodied.
Mm,
It was a creator as opposed to just a performer.
yes.
You know, so if you look at all the top name performers from the era right before what you mentioned, it's mainly people doing other songs penned by other people. You know,
Right.
the whole, you know, Lieber and Stoller catalog and whatever, all the Carole King tunes. You
Yes.
know, a lot
Tin,
of
the
that
Tin
stuff.
Pan Alley
Yeah.
thing.
So
Yes.
this
That
sort
line
of
in the
line
sand
in the sand, yeah,
right,
is
is
where
pretty major.
yeah, that's where the paradigm shifts to. Not only are we writing our own things, we're performing it. You know, everyone in the band usually, not always, played an instrument or many instruments. More, and in these, in the better bands of that era, more than one person in the band sang. You know, so there was a lot going on, and it was so much to take in because it was coming from so many different places. Whether it's different people singing, showcased as a lead singer here and there, or they're all playing. You know, it's like there's a lot of that
lot of stimulation.
excitement. You know, whereas
Definitely.
before it's like, yeah, this guy,
Hey, it's Cliff Richard.
yeah, right. You know,
Hey, it's
right. Tom Jones.
Tom Jones.
Right,
It's
you know.
Johnny Mathis.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
which is great. Engelbert Humperdinck. I mean,
Fantastic.
it's all terrific
Great-
stuff.
great
Pat
performers.
Boone, Frank Sinatra,
Performers,
Elvis Presley,
great performers,
vocalists.
Mm-hmm.
But yes,
Yeah.
the self-contained artist is an exciting development.
And I think that's what got more people inspired as life went on to do that.
To do it.
You know?
Right.
Yeah. He's doing it. I could do that.
I can do that.
And it kind of, I don't say it levels the playing field a little bit, but I think it allowed for more diversity. Like if you're not the kind of artist who's going to be an Elvis or a Tom Jones, you know, who's mainly just a singer, dancer, you know, type of thing.
Right. If you're Donald Fagen.
Right. You've got a shot.
Or you're Billy Joel.
You
or
sit behind the piano.
Reginald Dwight.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You can get it. You can get a record contract.
Right.
And you can write your own song. I mean, can you imagine that in 1971, Walter Becker and Donald Fagen looking the way they looked? You know, these two college, who by the way went to Bard College. Just letting you know.
Okay.
You know, these guys were hip jazz bow, strange looking cats, man. How do they get a recording contract? Which is to your point. And for me, that's why that's the peak. Because it didn't necessarily have to do with, say, image or the way you looked or the way you were presenting yourself in that way. You didn't have to be a teeny bopper. You didn't have to be a conventionally handsome or beautiful person it was about your art. It was about what you were producing. The Steely Dan experience you'd be hard pressed to find someone like that these days.
Or prior.
And definitely
right.
prior. It never occurred before them.
Right.
But gosh, you know, what a gift. You know, I'd say near miraculous that a guy named Gary Katz in California heard these weird, eggheady, strange jazz rock hybrid songs by these two cats and one guy with this really weird singing voice and signed them up to ABC Dunhill or whatever it was. And you get that run of albums.
Yeah.
I mean, what? You know, only the best music ever. So.
And guided only by what it sounds like. You know, that was the...
How it's played, how it's composed, how it's produced, what the musicians are actually doing.
Yep.
Wow, what a concept.
And that's, to just wind it back a minute to that transition once again from performer to artist. You know, like the other thing was, I was talking to somebody the other day about the Monkees, and you know, the fact that I think their earlier stuff wasn't.
No, it wasn't them.
Right?
They didn't play it or write it.
They ended up having to figure that out, or I don't know if they ended up learning the songs or beginning to write their own. I mean, I know Nesmith was a
Nesmith was a fine songwriter in his own right, and he stubbornly. Once they were huge. He especially. See, Mickey Dolenz was happy. God bless him. Mickey Dolenz and rest in peace, the great Davy Jones, who were the two singers, were more than happy to ride the train. And what a train, by the way.
Yeah.
You know, we take the Monkees for granted, but the Monkees were awesome. And they had the best pop songwriters working. Boyce and Hart, Neil Diamond
sure.
writes "I'm a Believer." I mean, that fabulous dude who had a hit with Jon Stewart, had a hit in '79 or so with a great song called "Gold" with Stevie Nicks singing on it. Jon Stewart writes "Daydream Believer." I mean, these are all-time, greatest of all-time pop songs. But Nesmith and Peter Tork, who were musicians as well, they were accomplished players. Michael Nesmith was a fine writer in his. They stubbornly said, I'm leaving if we can't do this ourselves. And then by the third or fourth album, they start writing and recording everything. And sadly, their popularity tapers off almost immediately,
right?
Because God bless him, Michael Nesmith is not writing I'm a Believer or Daydream Believer or Last Train to Clarksville. He's not.
Right.
And there's a great story where the guy who had the rock concert series, Kirshner.
Yeah.
He was their guy. Don Kirshner was feeding them the best songs in the world, and he said his next tune to Davy Jones was "Sugar, Sugar, da 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 da, oh, honey, honey." Can you imagine had Davy Jones sung that song? That would have been another massive #1 single for the Monkees. But Michael Nesmith and Peter Tork said, "No more of that, Don."
Wow. Okay.
So that's pretty wild.
Well, good for them in a way. You know, I mean, not really, but and my other point involving them and that whole thing is that to be in this business at that time, prior to the shift, you not only had to be a good singer and possibly, whatever sort of performer in that right, but you probably had to act, you probably had to know how to dance, that all went away. And so if you weren't doing that either, that's what opened up the door for these other folks to do their thing, They weren't relegated to the Brill Building.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So,
or the Sammy Davis
which
Jr.
for the people
model.
who don't know what that is, you want to...
The Brill Building was this fabulous area in New York City where all the finest songwriters were employed by publishing houses to come up with the next hit. And you get Neil Sedaka, and you get Neil Diamond, and you get Carole King working with her, I believe her husband, Jerry Goffin. Paul Simon was there in the early 60s. Gosh. And that's also amazing too. To just be a professional songwriter.
Well, that's not a thing either now. I mean, right.
Well,
so imagine,
Diane Warren.
But I mean like,
it went into that.
I'm going to work. Where you go? I'm going to work.
I'm going to work in the Brill Building.
Songs all day.
I'm going to take the train in from Queens, and I'm going to hang out with my old pal Carole King, and we're going to demo up some tunes.
Right,
and Carole and Jerry just wrote "Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow?"
Yeah. Like there was a building where that's what was going on, and
where that was happening
day in and day out.
Awesome.
Like, it was an industry in and of itself. And I'm not saying there isn't full-time songwriters.
Well, now that's in
mean,
Nashville. I would
true.
imagine.
Just I don't know if there's a compound anywhere where
that I wouldn't know.
What I mean?
Like, is there a legendary? Well, you had Hitsville, USA, in Detroit, where Berry Gordy and his staff came up with the greatest songs and records ever, and you had the Brill Building. Where those people, amazing people, were all coming up with. Yeah. It's a magical time. The 60s and then spilling over into the 1970s is as far as popular music goes, that's the watershed, from what I can tell. And it's not like I'm not biased because I was even there, because I wasn't.
Right.
I was born in 1970. And you were born in 72.
72, yep.
So we missed the 60s entirely. And yet we grew up in the 70s. So we had the glory of 1970s AM radio, or as we like to call it, AM gold. Singles of just delight, and Afternoon Delight. Put that on. Put that on and listen to Afternoon Delight. Yeah, it's a little hokey, but it's phenomenal. And Captain and Tennille, their big hit, which I love, Will Keep Us Together. I mean, the pop music coming out of the 70s, the soul music coming out of the 70s, and obviously the classic rock, which is the best. We grew up on that. And then we then we came of age in the 80s. But truth be told, I know I was, and I'm sure you were, we were always tuning into the 60s.
Sure. Well, everything that came after that was still rolling down the hill with the momentum from
of that
60s stuff. And it was always a way, there was always some kind of a nod to that, whether it was an intentional or not by the artist. It just was there. It was just intrinsically part of whatever became
of the DNA
after
and the makeup.
That, yeah. And that's, I think that's an important thing. And I think that actually, maybe with not as much strength, but it definitely still continued into the 90s. And there were
dipped.
There were hills and valleys of that particular aesthetic. The late 80s, it was it was hard to detect. Although there was a lot of stuff that are masked. There's a lot of music that's masked with the big 80s production that has Motown vibes to it. I mean, how much of that stuff is
Journey.
You know what I mean?
What about Raised on Radio?
Of course,
the Raised on Radio
but
album.
even like more, just more like what you would consider down the middle pop hits.
4 on the Floor, boom, boom,
like,
boom, boom.
It's like, oh, yeah, okay, well, that's just Motown, with gated reverb.
Right.
Right.
Well, Phil Collins, certainly.
Sure.
But
even, there were British bands doing that. There was...
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever. There's just... even
Duran.
Steve Winwood, his comeback record was heavily influenced by that sound,
Definitely.
It just...
Masked in the production
of totally. But
that year.
At its core...
It
had that going on, so
yeah.
it's sort of never really left. It just took different forms.
Yeah, because each decade, I find that annoys me in a way, the superficiality of a decade as a definition. But I get it. I mean, it's a simplification of classifying things. So the 80s had to be dictated by the continuing developments in technology and the entrance of the digital medium as a recording device and the DX7 keyboard and the Fairlight and the drum machine and all these things that producers jumped on, and the MTV, the visual experience. We'll get to that too. Personally, I think the MTV thing pretty much ruined.
That sort of goes along
with my line.
End date.
Yeah. I mean, MTV is 81. So I could say to you that, and I should have, for me, the arc that you're talking about is really 65 to 81. Yeah. But great music is made in the 1980s. A lot. Yeah. I mean, tremendous stuff. Prince, obviously, Michael Jackson, U2, REM, Bruce Springsteen, The Police. That George Michael was really special. He was doing Motown.
Oh, totally.
That's total Motown.
Yeah.
And thank God, right? But the MTV, the concept, the refocusing to the visual, while superficially entertaining at the time to young people, I think did undermine and put a slow decay and end to what I'm viewing as your zeitgeist arc that you're asking me.
Well, in a way, if you look at it as aesthetically, in an aesthetic way, it almost is a return to what we were talking about,
Yes.
like what you had before that were whatever TV specials say that were on in the 60s, American Bandstand, Top of the Pops, Ed Sullivan, all that stuff. And so that was a window into a visual aspect of an act. And obviously the audiences being mainly younger people, I guess, for the most part, responded to that, for lots of different reasons. And that's what MTV became, that 24/7, and I think the artists that were coming out of the late 70s or emerging in the early, they didn't know what to do with that. You know what I'm saying? Like, and some of them didn't do anything. Some of them only put out clips of live stuff, and that was their video. That was the video of that song. And some made horrible videos because they didn't know what they were doing, or
trying to look cool,
right?
But looking
or some,
silly.
Or some director got a hold of them and said, "Here's what we're going to do," and it was, like you think of half of these scenarios that these bands found themselves in, trying to like if you think of like You Got Lucky or something like that, Tom, those guys are like
what is
post-apocalyptic
Yeah.
cowboys
Jeep.
on motorcycles.
Mad
and-
Max.
Yeah, or if like the Pretty Woman video from Van Halen or something like that.
No, but that was great. And they were great at making videos. David Lee Roth was great
Yeah,
at
that's
making
true.
videos.
That's
So I
true.
wouldn't, I'm thinking more of Separate Ways by Journey. You take a look at that video.
I know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like, okay.
Yeah. I mean, how did you? Now I would say you look at it. And
Oh, I
if
loved
you were
it at
in
the
the band. That's all for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this conversation and keep coming back for more. To learn more about Steven or myself, including links to our own musical creative endeavors, you can find us on the web at stephenbard.com and ryanball.com. Or you can find us on Instagram at stephenbard1 and at ryanballmusic. If you'd like to support the podcast, the most impactful way to do that is to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, and on YouTube. While you're at it, leave a comment or a review. Sharing the show or your favorite episode on social media is also very helpful. Finally, donations to the podcast are greatly appreciated and can be sent via Venmo to at Stephen-Bard-Music or at Ryan J. Ball. Today's show was recorded, produced, engineered, and edited by Stephen Bard and Ryan Ball. Theme music is by Ryan Ball. We appreciate all the love and support, and we'll see you soon.